Hey everybody, I'm Scott Allen Miller. Today on Sam IT, we're going to tackle the difficult question of how many disks can I lose in my RAID array? Now, we've covered a lot of different RAID levels in our RAID series, and in each one we've either said or implied how many disks we can lose in an array. So, real quickly, let's cover what people often say. In RAID 0, there's no protection. If you lose any disk, all is lost. In RAID 1, people assume you have dual mirroring, two-way mirroring, so you can lose any one disk out of your two, and the other's okay, but if you lose everything, then all is lost. In RAID 2, 3, 4, and 5, even those that are never used, this is all single parity, or single hamming in the case of RAID 2, and you can lose any one disk of your array and you're fine. You can still rebuild. With RAID 6, you have dual parity, you can lose any two disks, and with RAID 7 or RAID 5.3, you can lose any 3 disks due to its triple parity. This is what people say, and it's complete and utter BS. This is marketing, or it's an attempt to simplify RAID to a point of absurdity so that we don't have to deal with the complexities that actually come up with RAID. RAID is complex. Storage is complex. We cannot distill it in this way. It doesn't make any sense. It's also presented in such a way to make it sound better than it is in a lot of cases because people want to promote easy answers, so they promote them extra hard. So let's back up and look at what these things even mean. So for example, with RAID 5, we say we can lose any one disk. Okay, but if we could lose any one disk and guarantee recovery, we would never need RAID 6 because we would never have to worry about two disk failure because disks obviously fail one at a time. And so RAID 6 at some point had a single disk failure our RAID 5 our RAID 6 would have had a single disk failure at some point. We would never have needed the second had the first been guaranteed protection. Obviously, there's a risk at some point of a second disk failing. And if a second disk fails, it violates the if one disk fails, we can recover rule. There's an implication here that if one disk fails and a second does not, then we can guarantee recovery. But that is not stated in any meaningful way. It's stated in such a way that if only one disk fails, you will recover. But clearly, there's a fear, and that's why RAID 6 and 7 were created, because RAID 5, with only being able to lose one disk at a time, still carries some risk. So, we need to back up and figure out how this risk looks. And what this risk is secondary disk failure risk. In non-nested RAID, this is not incredibly complex, but we often use nested RAID and then things get crazy. So let's start with non-nested RAID and let's ignore RAID 0 because RAID 0 never matters in any discussion of redundancy or protection because it has no protection. So it doesn't matter. But with RAID 1 or RAID 5, we have the risk of secondary disk failure. Should a second disk fail in either of these arrays, our chances of recovery are 0. Doesn't matter which one you have, the chances are 0. There's no data left for you to recover. With RAID 1, however, we have an array that is mirrored. So the first disk failing does nothing to create or increase the chances of a second disk failing. It's just normal disk risk math that we have to use. And if we use more than two disks in a mirror, each one has a full copy. And so our chances of disk failure would go up because we have more disks, but each one's a mirror, so we get additional protection as we do that. But we normally ignore that because 1, people never do that, and 2, we're no longer dealing with single disk failure protection. Suddenly it becomes 2 or 3 or 4 disk protection, however much you want. So RAID 1 we can scale out should we have a fear of secondary disk failure. With RAID 5, it's a little bit different because the larger the array gets, the riskier it gets. It does not add additional protection. So the chances that another disk will fail in a 3-disk RAID 5 array versus a 10 or a 50-disk RAID 5 array are dramatically different. So we have to look at this expanding risk over the scale of the array to really understand what our risks look like. We also have to deal with the fact that parity arrays, when they're degraded, which is what we call it when one of their disks has failed, are at an increased chance compared to normal of another disk failing. This is because the stresses on the disks have changed. This is not a well understood phenomenon. A lot of places, because there isn't solid math behind it, simply ignore this increased risk scenario. But it's important to understand that parity RAID, even with the same number of disks, is more likely to experience additional disk failure than mirrored RAID under a degraded state. This means that even if we came to a scenario where we said, well, the risk of a secondary disk failing based on averages is equal, it's not actually equal, but we don't know how much riskier it is. No one's ever done a study large enough to identify the exact math that gives us the rate at which parity RAID increases failures, but what we do know is that it's been an industry accepted phenomenon for more than 20 years that parity RAID, when degraded, puts additional strain on the remaining disks and increases their chance of failure during that time or shortly thereafter. This is generally understood as simply being anytime you change the behavior of disks, you increase the risks to them to some degree. So you just have to be aware it's not a huge number. You don't suddenly trigger the failure of all your disks, but it is enough that people witness it commonly. So it really does happen. It's not in the 0.1% kind of risk numbers. It's more like the 10 to 20%. But it's still just an increase in secondary disk risk. But we have more we have to consider, and this starts getting complex because it starts getting into implementations and CPU power and caching and all kinds of things that are not exactly the RAID array itself, and so we have to look at how we're supporting it. And that is, how long does it take to recover a disk? If we have a RAID 1 array and a RAID 5 array, and each has one disk fail, and we immediately or magically replace that disk the second that the original has failed, we then begin the process of recovering that disk, or resilvering. In the case of RAID 1, this happens as fast as the first disk can be copied to the second. If we have each disk is 1 terabyte, we simply need to copy 1 terabyte from one disk to the other. With RAID 5, we can't do that. We have to take and read all the data from every disk in the array, which could be as low as 2 additional disks, and then compute the final disk. This means we have to do 2 reads. Now, those reads happen simultaneously, so if we're talking about 1 terabyte disks, we don't have to read 2 terabytes sequentially. It's still 1 terabyte worth of reading time. But at the end of each block read, we then have to apply a calculation to that and then write that to the third disk. This takes time, but how much time is heavily determined by your controller and the implementation and how busy the array is. Technically, RAID 1 is also impacted by how busy the array is, but not in the same way. It's still lesser. So we don't know how much more it will take for a RAID 5 array to rebuild or resilver, but we do know that it will take longer than RAID 1. Does it take 1% longer or 1,000% longer? That's difficult to say, and you'd have to test it under your load and your conditions with your controllers and settings to really have a good feel for how it will impact you specifically. What we do know is that the larger your array gets, the longer this process takes. So a 3-disk RAID 5 with 1 terabyte disks versus a 20 terabyte or a 20-disk array with 1 terabyte drives will be dramatically different, and the amount of math that has to be done to recreate that one disk goes up dramatically with each additional disk added to the array. So what could be a pretty quick recovery with a 3-disk array could become a very lengthy one at 20 disks. If you're doing something like RAID 6, this becomes even more dramatic still, as there's so much more parity math that has to be done for the same resilvering process. It is so dramatic that we generally consider that the amount of time needed for any RAID 1 disk to be recovered to be in a matter of hours, maybe many hours, but hours, less than a day. Once we get into RAID 5, we often start thinking of our recovery in terms of days, even if it's only 1 or 2. And when we start getting into RAID 6, it is not uncommon to start looking at our recovery in terms of many days or a few weeks, with the longest recoveries that I've personally witnessed hitting over the 6-month mark. These numbers are important for multiple reasons. First is that secondary disk failure is dependent heavily on the amount of time at which the array is at risk to secondary disk failure. Obviously, if you have a RAID 5 array, you lose a disk and you resilver it, it recovers in a day, and you lose a second disk at the 2-day mark, you don't care because you have a healthy RAID 5 that is designed to protect against secondary disk failure. Now it's healthy. You have not secondary disk failure, but primary disk failure because you managed to recover before that second disk failed. So you're simply able to replace that one. If your recovery was to take several days or weeks or even months, your time of exposure to additional disk failure grows dramatically. The chances that any disk will fail in a large array over a 2-month period is much higher than its risk of failing over a 4-hour period. You can extrapolate that math pretty quickly, but it's way more likely. It's like if I'm driving 1 mile in a car or 1,000 miles in a car, when am I more likely to have an accident? Definitely 1,000 miles versus 1 mile. You have a lot more opportunities to accidentally veer into something or have something run out in front of you. So that extended time that certain types of RAID arrays create during their recovery generates a huge amount of risk time during which bad things can happen. And that's where we start getting into really complex scenarios that we cannot tell you the exact math as to how risky your arrays are based on their array level. We have to look at many factors, including the usage cases that you have, the size of the disks, the types of the disks, the speed of the CPU, how much of it you can dedicate to the resilvering process, and things like that. So there's no simple math to answer these questions. Plus, we don't know the math for some of the problems, such as disk failure rates. Those are difficult at best to kind of come up with a rough number for, and the amount that parity RAID resilvering impacts the risk, we have no idea. We simply know that it does. And with RAID 6 or RAID 7, if you have multiple disk failures, each one increases the impact of that number over and over again, while also extending the amount of time and power needed to do its resilver. So it's very complex, and we simply have to make educated guesses. There's no question that of the same size array, a RAID 6 array versus a RAID 5, the RAID 6 is dramatically safer, even though it has a lot of problems from needing to resilver over a long period of time, but it does have that extra protection. And RAID 7 or RAID 5.3 is dramatically safer than that, but its amount of time needed to recover gets really long as well. Now, that's only looking at secondary disk failure. That's just the tip of the iceberg as far as risks with RAID. Now, there's other types of risks that we're not going to look at in this particular video because this one's getting long, and we're really looking at how many disks can I lose. But this is only one failure scenario. So it's also important to understand that there are other types of failures, such as UREs, which affect different types of arrays at different times in different ways. Parity arrays, RAID 5 and 6 and 7, when they get exposed to UREs, which only happens at times where all of the parity disks have failed and you are down to what is essentially a RAID 0, you're at the point where you must recover at least one disk to have any protection. At that point, they become fully exposed to a URE, which is an unrecoverable read error. That's at the point at which one of the remaining healthy disks has part of it that cannot be read. The reason that parity arrays are so heavily exposed to UREs is because the array is a single file as far as the disk is concerned. It's not exactly a file, but for all intents and purposes, that's how it works. Should that file become corrupt, which is what happens when an exposed URE gets hit, suddenly that file is corrupt as a whole, and the expected and demonstrated behavior of parity arrays is that the entire array will be lost. All of it. So it's important to understand that the array itself will be lost under conditions where there's no additional disk failure. And this is an even larger reason why people saying that RAID 5 can simply lose one disk and recover is false. It is not just possible that a RAID 5 array, having lost one disk and being in the process of recovering, may be unable to recover even without losing another disk. It is the most likely failure scenario. That's really important. People often treat UREs as being so unlikely because they're not well understood that you will never actually have to worry about it. But that's not at all the case. In fact, it's completely the opposite. UREs represent the largest risk to RAID arrays, and they are not well understood and often not documented, and we only know mathematically certain things about them. We know general averages, and we know that under failure conditions they skyrocket, whereas under non-failure conditions they plummet. So that if you were to do tests, and many people do, specifically to mislead people, by taking a healthy array, pulling out a healthy disk, and demonstrating mathematically that they should have hit a URE, and doing this over and over again, they actually know that they're not going to hit a URE with any likelihood because they're misleading you as to what an average is. It's easy to sell people on the idea of an average means that it always happens at a constant rate, and that is in no way what the term average means, and it is extremely well known that UREs are not evenly distributed. They do not, so often these numbers say that they will be hit something like every 8 trillion reads. You can demonstrate that you've just done 100 trillion reads and it never got hit, so UREs must be false. But in a failure mode, what actually happens is disks that are failing may hit a URE every 1 trillion reads, and when healthy, only once every 250 trillion reads, so that the average comes out to 8. That's where things get complicated. And we're going to do some videos just on UREs because they're worth digging into, but it is extremely important to understand that when people tell you that RAID 5 can survive any one disk failing and you only have to worry if a second disk fails, they are completely blowing smoke and hoping that you don't look into what are the actual factors involved with array failures. Your most likely risk isn't that second disk failing, it's hitting a URE during that degraded state. So, just be aware, you cannot say things like, how many disks can I lose, and figure out your risk based on that. It doesn't work that way. RAID is much more complicated. Now, are RAID 1 arrays exposed to UREs when they're in a degraded state? Yes, they are. But they're not exposed to UREs in the same way. Parity arrays, like I said, get presented to the disk as basically a single file, and they corrupt as a whole. Mirrored arrays don't do this. They are mirrored at the block level, and if a URE is hit, it corrupts one block. It does not impact the rest of the disk. It doesn't need to recalculate anything, so there isn't a array failure when a RAID 1 hits a URE. There is file corruption with one block being unreadable with one URE. Now, if that one block happens to hit something really critical, that may be highly noticeable to you. But if that one block hits something that is never used or is lightly used, it may never even come up. If it hits in the middle of an image file, for example, you may see it as a little blip in the image, but you're still going to be able to recover most of your data. And something like 99% of the time, when people hit UREs in degraded RAID 1s, they simply never notice. And you can prove this pretty easily. People using computers at home, desktops, laptops, and things like that, they don't have RAID, and that means that they are 100% exposed to UREs with every activity they do, and people don't sit around complaining about the UREs and how their stuff is corrupting all the time because it's almost never noticeable, even though we know it's happening to them on a regular basis. It just doesn't come up that much when you're not exposed as a complete array. So Parity RAID, RAID 5, 6, and 7 introduce this full array failure risk from UREs when degraded and exposed that other things don't experience. And that is the primary thing we have to be concerned about, and makes the entire concept of how many disks can I lose meaningless. It doesn't apply in that way. There are, of course, lots of minor risks with RAID arrays, but mostly these are the ones we're concerned about for data loss. There's another conversation we're going to have about data availability, but that doesn't impact this question of how many disks can I lose. So I just don't want to go without mentioning that this is not the entire picture, but these are the important ones. Now, I mentioned nested RAID arrays get really complex. They do, and the reason for that is that, well, let's look at it. RAID 10, by far the most common type of nested RAID. Probably something like 90% of all nested RAID is RAID 10, maybe more. With RAID 10, we have a RAID 0 stripe of RAID 1 mirrors under the hood. Each of those RAID 1 mirrors, of course, obeys standard RAID 1 math. If you lose one disk, you can recover as long as you don't lose the other one during the time that it recovers, and it recovers pretty quickly, as fast as the first one can copy to the second one. If we have a 4-disk RAID 10, that's 2 mirrors, we don't have any additional risk caused by the fact that we have the second mirror to the first mirror. If you lose one disk, it still is able to mirror to the other. And if you lose a second disk and it's not on that first array, it doesn't care. That second array is able to do its own thing and recover on its own without impacting the first. Every mirrored pair within a RAID 10 can lose one of its disks, and no matter how many more pairs you add to the RAID 10, does not increase the risk to any individual RAID 1. What does increase is that within the overall RAID 0 stripe, you have more RAID 1 pairs, and the risk that any given one of them may experience 2 disk failures at the same time could be, or is, higher. But it's important to understand that the individual arrays within that do not become more risky. So this is very complex, that we're increasing the number of RAID 1s that could present risk to us, but the individuals remain equal to what they were if they were standing alone. So figuring out the risk to RAID 10 gets complex, and people often state it in a way that is completely misleading. We should state that we can experience one or more disk failures, but the chances of secondary disk failure or even tertiary disk failure causing data loss is extremely low. Whereas if we were working with, say, RAID 5 or let's say RAID 6, tertiary disk failure in RAID 6 is a guaranteed 100% data loss. With RAID 10, if we had, say, 6 disks, we're something like a 50% chance that the third disk failing would cause data loss. And if we had more disks, then the chance that we get a third disk failing goes up, but the chances that the third disk failing causes data loss goes down. This is where it gets insanely complicated because we have to deal with so many factors in our risk math caused by the larger pool of disks making our curve go one way, but the larger number of failures going another. And then we have to deal with the fact that people talk about things in terms of how many disks can we lose, and that's just confusing. And all of this comes together to say 2 basic things. One is that RAID is complex, and we cannot simply distill it to how many disks can I lose. We must focus on what actually matters, and that is, at the end of the day, what is our overall risk number. And that should always be presented as like a percentage, never as how many disks can I lose. That concept exists for the purpose of marketing and misleading. It is designed as a statement to produce an emotional reaction where you feel you are protected in scenarios where you easily are not. Or, when dealing with other types of RAID, to create a reaction where you fear how likely it is that something is going to happen without looking at the big picture and realizing how safe it actually is. It's designed to move certain types of RAID, or, in many cases, simply to simplify things because people don't want to have to worry about how complex the math actually is. What's most important here is understanding that RAID 10 is safer than RAID 6 in all but the most extreme circumstances, based on its overall final risk numbers. But if we were to look at things like how many disks can we lose, it becomes very misleading because no matter how big or how safe your RAID 10 is, you can never say that you can guarantee that you can lose more than 2 disks. And RAID 6, you can guarantee you can lose any 2, but it covers up the fact that the RAID 6 is way more likely to experience that tertiary disk failure than the RAID 10 is, and that the RAID 10 may survive many disks failing and may even likely survive them, and doesn't have the URE exposure at the array level. So this is all very complex, and I'm sorry that this video is so long. It is very hard to convey this information, and at the end of the day, all we can say is that everything you've been told is wrong and misleading, and it doesn't apply the way that you think it does. Sorry about that. RAID is complex. We are going to do a video that does a bit of explaining just what's risky and when. And we're going to do another one about availability, because that's a completely different type of failure mode. It is what it is. Welcome to RAID, and this is why people have such big arguments about RAID, is because there's a huge desire to keep it simple. RAID cannot be treated that way, and people want the information that they've been told to be true, or things that they've worked from, because they have an emotional reaction and want to be tied to it. Thanks for joining me. Remember to like and subscribe. Ask your questions below. This is one that will probably get quite a few comments if people can make it through how long the video is. And remember, you can always sponsor us on Patreon.